Yo guys, what is up? Max for Diablo 4 video, and today we're going over a Shadow Blight Necromancer build that's putting out around 2 billion damage a second. It's getting up to like 2.6 billion damage. Dots in this game tick twice per second. Our highest dot ticks are just over a billion damage, so 2 ticks a second equals 2 billion damage, which is just ridiculous. Now, I wanted to showcase this build on this channel because it is not a Necromancer minion build. I'm not a huge fan of the minion playstyle. I just find it a little bit boring. So if you're looking for a more active Necromancer build that also can clear really high tiers of the pit and do ridiculous amounts of damage, I think this is a great build for you. Hope you guys enjoy the video. Let's get right into it. Before we get into the full video, proper credit to the build creator. This build was made by C-Rock. I featured his Dot Necromancer build on the channel like 2 seasons ago. It was called Pentadot, if you remember it. This is his revised and improved version of that build for Season 4 that is scaling up way more damage. And today we're going to be going over everything that you need to know, but I will have a link down to his channel if you want to drop him some love. I really do appreciate that, and huge congratulations to him for making such a ridiculous build. Now, to start, let's go over the big damage mechanics of this setup. So there's a few really important aspects of this build that you kind of need to understand in order to start really scaling your damage. The first is the blighted aspect. This reads that after our Shadow Blight hits enemies 10 times, we're going to get 240% increased damage for 6 seconds. Now, Shadow Blight is a big part of this build, but it's a big part of it for this aspect and the utility that it provides. We're not really scaling the Shadow Blight damage per se as much. We are going to be scaling something else. So big important multiplier there on the blighted. The next big thing for us is intelligence. We've got 2,764 intelligence. Intelligence in of itself is a big skill multiplier for us, but we really care about it for the legendary Paragon node called Wither. Now, Wither is going to give us a chance for our shadow damage over time effects to deal bonus damage, and it scales directly off of the amount of intelligence that we have. With this build, we currently have a 51% chance for our shadow damage over time effects to deal 234% increased damage. And the last big multiplier that you really need to pay attention on this build, obviously damage over time and damage is all super important, but the real hidden thing that you probably wouldn't have guessed is attack speed. Now, with this build, the big part of our damage is from the ebonpiercer amulet. We've got corpse explosions, we've got blight, we've got all of these things, but 99% of our damage, or like 96% of our damage, is from the ebonpiercer projectiles that proc off of blight. Now, the reason this is so important is because all of these projectiles, one, deal this big flat shadow damage, and two, they shotgun. So even though that they shoot a bunch of projectiles like this, if we're close up to an enemy, we can shotgun them, and then we can start stacking our dots. So just to give you a showcase, a lot of our other skills are giving us tons of damage multipliers, but just casting Blight alone, literally not clicking anything else on this dummy, there we're at 21 million dot ticks. There's 38, 40 million, 68 million, 76 million, 120 million, 132 million dot ticks just pressing one skill. That is not factoring in any of the other rest of our damage rotation. Just shotgunning enemies, clicking one button, we're getting, what, like 260 million DPS, which is just ridiculous. And so the ebonpiercer is a really big, important part of that. You're going to want to try to find an ebonpiercer amulet with the highest base damage on its aspect as possible. All the other stats, really nice. The base damage is the most important one. For our gear, we're going to be using the Harlequin crest. This isn't like a must-have item for the build, but it is pretty nice because it comes with all things that we care about, all stats, more intelligence, max life, resource gen, cooldown, plus damage reduction and ranks to our skills. The ranks to our skills we don't care as much about. As you can see with our skills, there's nothing that we're really scaling that many skills of. Even on corpse explosion, we've only got 1 point into it. Corpse tendrils, we've only got 1 point into it. So the plus ranks to our skills, not as important, but the resource, the cooldown, the all stats, the max life, and the DR are all pretty fantastic for us. If you don't have a Harlequin, I'd recommend using the aspect of the metamorphosis on your boots so that you get another source of unstoppable, and then move the concussive strikes up onto your helmet. Next up on your chest piece, the big thing that you're going to notice is that we're really prioritizing is intelligence. Remember that intelligence is a huge multiplier for us, and we're also going to want to get essence per second, as we're going to want to be able to spam our blight as much as possible so that we can always be scaling those damage per seconds. Now, when we actually go to our essence per second, we are going to be getting 32 essence per second, which is pretty ridiculous. And Blight currently only costs 19. So we're basically at the point with our essence cost reduction and our essence gen that we're able to spam Blight constantly. As you can see, when I'm doing this, my bar just doesn't go down. The way that Sirach has set this up is that we can constantly spam, never have to worry about that, and then is due in part with greater affixes to essence per second. Next up, we're going to get max life, corpse tendril size, so that we can group more enemies, be more efficient with our clear and our dodge, and then more damage reduction. On our gloves, once again, we're looking for intelligence, attack speed, damage over time, shadow damage over time, which is big for our multipliers, and a source of CC, as well as the aspect of the damned, that we deal increased shadow damage to enemies afflicted by any curse. We're going to be applying Decrepify. Decrepify in our skill tree is going to have a damage multiplier, and on our gloves, we've got another damage multiplier. This is huge for us. On our pants, we're looking for a lot of survivability. This is where we're going to be trying to get our armor cap. So we've got an armor roll, max life, intelligence, more max life, and another stun. And then each time that Bone Storm damages an enemy, we gain a barrier. We're mainly using Bone Storm as a way to get some extra survivability on the build. We're also going to be using the conceited aspect so that we're going to deal increased damage, another multiplier when we actually have Bone Storm up. So this is mainly a survivability tool, but we will get some extra damage from it. Next up on your boots, essence per second, really important, intelligence and move speed, more move speed, and then concussive strikes is just another damage multiplier. We're going to be lucky hitting pretty often with this build. With our weapon, we're going to be doing some interesting things. You're really looking for intelligence, damage, and damage over time. More damage instead of shadow damage over time. This is a little bit of a tricky part of the build. Technically, damage is the better temper than shadow damage over time, because our damage over time double dips in all damage versus shadow damage in only single dips. However, it's a lot easier to brick your weapons by rolling for percent damage than it is rolling for shadow damage, simply for the fact that if you're rolling shadow damage, you can also hit darkness skill damage, which is still beneficial to the build, versus damage you really only can hit damage. Close damage is technically fine, but you're really looking for just percent increased damage. And then Bone Storm duration is what we're going to be going as our second temper. There is a temper that allows you to shoot extra projectiles with Blight. However, those extra projectiles on Blight do not proc extra ebonpiercers, and because ebonpiercer is 99% of the damage of this build and Blight is not, we're actually going to be going for Bone Storm duration so that we get more barrier uptime and more damage multiplier from conceited. So that is what we're using on our weapon. For our amulet, as I mentioned, we're using ebonpiercer. And lastly, on our rings, we're going to be going for intelligence, attack speed, and damage over time or max life. The big thing with your rings is we actually get to put skulls on to hit our armor cap because we have so much intelligence. Just from our intelligence alone, we're getting 69% resistances. So those are pretty easily solved. And then on our rings, we're going for resource gen so that our essence per second is more beneficial. And then either shadow damage over time or percent damage. Once again, percent damage is the better roll, but shadow damage over time has less chance of bricking your items if you've got a perfect item. Sirach was telling me that he didn't want to have the chance of bricking these triple greater affix rings, so that's why he went for shadow damage over time, but damage over time is technically the better temper. Last thing I wanted to mention with the gear is the aspect of retribution. Now, for some reason, this aspect is double dipping. So even though it says you're only getting 30% increased damage, you're getting 60% multiplier on enemies that are stunned. And remember that when a boss goes into its stagger phase, it's counted as everything. It's counted as frozen, it's counted as dazed, it's counted as immobilized, it's counted as stunned. So a big part of this build, and the reason why we're tempering all of these chances to stagger and stuff, is because we want the boss to go into its stunned phase, where it can't move as quick as possible, because we're going to be getting a double dip damage multiplier from Retribution on those staggered stunned bosses, which is really going to amp up our damage. And that's why on this build, when you're playing it, you won't see hitting for 900 million on ads, is because the ads will die too quickly. They will die before the dot really starts to ramp up on them while they're stunned. You've got too many damage multipliers, and that's kind of the real cool thing about this, is normally dot builds are great for mobbing and suck for bossing. This build actually is almost better for bossing because it truly gets to ramp up all of its damage, as opposed to like other dot builds where their dot damage can kind of fizzle out on bossing. For the Book of the Dead, pretty self-explanatory. We're going to get the increased shadow damage for the sacrifice from our warriors. For the mages, we're going to get increased damage to vulnerable enemies, which will be applied through our corpse tendrils. And then golems, we're going to be getting increased attack speed. Attack speed, remember, is a huge multiplier for us because it allows us to stack more dots per second. Next up for our skill tree, we're going to start with Reap. Reap, 2 points, mainly just to get down to our Blight. Here in Blight, we're going to be grabbing Supernatural to get a damage multiplier against enemies hit by Blight. And we're also going to make sure to grab Imperfectly Balanced. Now, this seems to be a bit bugged, but Imperfectly Balanced does give a damage multiplier to the projectiles cast from ebonpiercer. I don't know why, just Blizzard shenanigans, but make sure that you grab Imperfectly Balanced. Next up, Hued Flesh for a lucky hit chance to proc corpses when we're damaging enemies. Then we're moving down to Blood Mist with Ghastly Blood Mist, more corpse creations. This is mainly a source of unstoppable and survivability for us. Then we're going Corpse Explosions, more darkness damage from Blighted. We're not scaling the damage of this up. We're mainly using Corpse Explosion as a way to get more dots and stack more damage so that Shadow Blight procs more often, so that we get more uptime of that massive multiplier. Fueled by Death, we get increased damage after we consume a corpse. This is another damage multiplier for our like ebonpiercer projectiles. Then we got Death's Embrace, more damage and less damage taken. Death's Approach for more movement speed. Decrepify, really important because we're going to be using it with amplified damage for more damage from cursed enemies. And Abhorrent Decrepify so that we can get our cooldowns back. We're going to grab Corpse Tendrils with the all-important Vulnerable. Really great source of Vulnerable for us. With Necrotic so that we can get some more Fortify. Grab everything here. All of these are pretty great for our like shadow damage, but the real important things are Terror and Gloom. Gloom reads when you damage enemies with darkness skills, they take increased shadow damage from you, which stacks. And Terror, we deal increased shadow damage to enemies who are slowed or chilled, and increased shadow damage to enemies who are stunned, immobilized, or frozen. On our gear, remember that we had ways to stun, ways to freeze off of lucky hits, and we're going to be lucky hit proccing quite a bit. So another damage multiplier there. Lastly, sacrifice bonuses, because we're not using minions. Bone Storm is survivability, extra DR when Bone Storm is up. We don't care about the crit chance. We're not a crit build. Dots don't crit. And then Shadow Blight with a 900% damage multiplier. Once again, Shadow Blights are mainly for the aspect with it, but they are doing some damage on the build. Lastly, for our Paragon board, we're really prioritizing getting 7 glyphs. In our first board, we're going to be using Gravekeeper for increased damage whenever we are close to a corpse. And this is also going to give us more damage, more intelligence, more armor, all great things. Then we're going to go for Amplify, which enemies affected by curses take increased damage. That's another multiplier for us, more shadow damage over time. Make sure we grab Wither for that huge multiplier. Then we're going to be coming over to the Scent for Death. This is more damage reduction and more damage for us. More resistances, more damage to injured enemies with Sacrificial to deal increased damage while we have no active minions. Another huge multiplier for us. Tenacity, extra max life. Abyssal is going to be placed in the Bone Graft board. Sorry, this board was the Scent for Death board. This was the Wither board. We're putting Abyssal in the Bone Graft board to grab you and your minions, deal increased non-fizz damage. Another multiplier for us. Then we're going to be working our way over to the Bloodbath board, where we're going to be socketing Control. Once again, a huge part of the damage of this build is going to be when enemies are stunned. We're getting that double dip Retribution multiplier. Control is another multiplier against those crowd-controlled enemies. So huge damage when enemies are stunned. Thick Hide for more max life, damage while fortified. Then we're going into the Flesh Eater board. We consume 5 corpses. We get 40% increased damage, another ridiculous multiplier. When we're going to be putting the Scourge glyph, that we get 10% increased damage to enemies affected by shadow damage over time effects. Just more multipliers. It's no wonder this build is hitting so hard. So many multipliers, man. It's crazy. And then lastly, we've got Exploit for another damage multiplier to vulnerable enemies and more vulnerable damage to enemies that get hit by our corpse tendrils. And that is going to be socketed in the Hulking Monstrosity board. So once again, the glyphs that we're using are Abyssal, Amplify, Control, Exploit, Scourge, Sacrificial, and Gravekeeper. Guys, that is going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to go check out C-Rock, awesome content creator and really knows his stuff about Necromancer. I will catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.